Welcome back to another episode of Written for Our Admonition, Studies in the Old Testament. We're picking up in our conversation about what the Old Testament teaches us about God and His character, and that naturally leads us to a conversation about His holiness. Holiness is a major topic in the Old Testament. To be clear, it's a major topic about the New Testament too. But we find in the Old Testament that it's emphasized specifically in relation to God and how His people relate to Him also. So holiness becomes a pretty important deal to understand when we talk about what the Old Testament teaches us and how it presents to us who God is. So with that in mind, before we really get into our slideshow in earnest here, I want us to turn over to Leviticus chapter 19. Now here in Leviticus chapter 19, verses 1 through 2 specifically, we're going to find an interesting commandment that God gave to His people, and one that really goes against how we typically think about the idea of holiness today. So please join me in the reading of Leviticus chapter 19, verses 1 and 2. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to all the congregation of the children of Israel, and say to them, You shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. That sounds simple enough. But when we really understand holiness, we realize there's a lot that goes into the idea of being holy. There's a lot more to it than might first meet the eye. Holiness is a deep topic. There's a lot that goes into it based upon the teaching of the Old Testament, specifically this chapter in Leviticus chapter 19. If we were to read on, we would see many different areas where holiness manifests itself in someone's life. And it may not always be what we expect. In fact, many people will take a chapter like Leviticus chapter 19, they'll twist it and distort it in so many directions to criticize Christianity and criticize what the Old Testament says and just go on and on about it, without really understanding a lick of why God even bothered to put those commandments in place in the first place. They don't really think about why would God expect His people to not do certain things or to do certain things, and how that would connect to them being holy. Because fundamentally, when we talk about holiness, we understand that when it applies to God or when it applies to His people, it is the quality of being set apart from what is common. Now that naturally causes us to rethink how we see the world. Because going back to something I alluded to just a moment ago, how do we usually look at holiness as a topic and as an idea? We see it as something that is far out of reach. We see it as God is over there and we're over here, and there's this huge divide between us, and we can never bridge that gap. Now, that's not what Scripture teaches us, but that's the way we typically visualize holiness. It's something that only belongs to God. It's something that only He can possess. But what did we just read in Leviticus chapter 19? It shows that God has the expectation that His people will be holy as He is holy. And why would God command His people to be something they simply could never be? So we really have to think in clearer terms about holiness and understand there's a practical element to it that is not just a concept. It's not just an idea. It actually has something that affects our lives. So on that track, go back to the definition here on our second bullet point on this slide. Holiness is the quality of being set apart from what is common. Now again, that's not the way we typically see the world. We don't see the world as something where we can be set apart from it in the fullest sense. There are people who try. They try to go into the mountains or out into the wilderness or into rural areas, and they think that that will set them apart and prepare them for God's service, but that's not necessarily what Scripture is teaching either. In fact, there's some places like in Colossians that would maybe indicate that behavior is not really what makes someone holy and will not lead to the outcomes that one might expect. But with that in mind, we understand that being set apart means that we are unique. We are not going along with the way the world typically operates. There's something about us that is set apart from what is around. And that's where that word common comes into play. Now we understand that something that is common does not necessarily mean that it's evil or unclean. That's usually how Scripture will present it, but that's not always what that means. It can simply mean something that isn't really prepared for divine service. It's not really anything that is set apart for any particular reason. It's just something that is there, it exists for a purpose, but it's not really doing anything special or unique. Whereas something that is holy, especially something that is dedicated to God's service and becomes holy as a result of that dedication, that is something that is clearly set forth for His purposes, for His work, and for His service. It is not to be treated the same way that we would treat other things that are not that way. So we understand there's a distinction there. And that applies at several levels that we're going to understand as we go through the different ideas about holiness, how God presents this to us in His Word, and how the idea applies to Him as well. Now, the key thing we want to hone in on here as we go through this discussion, though, is this final bullet point here. That because of who God is, He must be approached in a special way. We're going to see what I mean by that as we go through this, but I want to put that seed in your mind as we go through this to understand When we talk about holiness, that's really what it comes down to, is that because God is holy, because he is set apart from this world, he is nothing like what we usually experience, he must be approached in a special way. And it's really going to be pretty critical as we go through this. So with that all said, we find then that whoever and whatever is associated with God is labeled as holy. Now again, this has many manifestations in the Old Testament, but the key thing that unites all of these different instances, whether we're talking about land, we're talking about people, we're talking about utensils like pots and pans and so forth that were in the tabernacle, no matter what it is, these things are never seen as common or unclean because they are labeled as holy by what God said. So with that in mind, I think there's one passage in particular that may come to mind when we talk about holiness that's really something we ought to think about. That's going to be found in Exodus chapter 3, verses 1 through 6. So here in Exodus chapter 3, verses 1 through 6, we have a familiar passage here at the start of this book where Moses is in the wilderness tending the flock of his father-in-law. And while he is there, he's going to encounter a burning bush. And that burning bush is going to speak to him and tell him to take off his sandals because the land where he stands is holy ground. So let's see what unfolds here in Exodus chapter 3, verses 1 through 6. Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the back of the desert and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire from the midst of a bush. So he looked, and behold, the bush was burning with fire, but the bush was not consumed. Then Moses said, I will now turn aside and see this great sight, why the bush does not burn. So when the Lord saw that he turned aside to look, God called to him from the midst of the bush and said, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here I am. Then he said, Do not draw near this place. Take your sandals off your feet, for the place where you stand is holy ground. Moreover, he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look upon God. Now, this is an interesting passage for several reasons, and there's a lot we could talk about from this. Let's really focus in on verses 4 through 6, though. So again, we already know that Moses is tending his father-in-law's flock. He's up on the mountain now. He sees a burning bush. He wonders about it, and that's when he turns to look at this bush. God calls to him from the burning bush, and what unfolds next is where we're focusing in on now. Look at verse 5 closely. Do not draw near this place. So he tells Moses basically, don't move any closer. Stay right where you are. Take your sandals off your feet, for the place where you stand is holy ground. Now think about that for a moment. Take your sandals off your feet. Why would he be told to do this? And how is it that the place where he is now labeled holy ground? What was it about this geography? What was it about this place that made it holy ground? And is it considered holy ground for all eternity? I mean, is it declared that way and it never changes? It's just holy ground and that the dirt there somehow has a different quality and characteristic to it than the other ground in other places on earth? Or is it not rather the fact that in this setting, what is taking place? We see that God has appeared to Moses in what scholars would call a theophany. It just means an appearance of God. That's a bit of a fancy term for it, but that's what we're talking about, is God appearing to one of his servants, in this case Moses. And in that appearance, that is what makes this place holy ground. It's not that this mountain was inherently holy in and of itself. It was just ground. It was just land. It wasn't anything special in and of itself. Now we know back in verse 1 it calls this the mountain of God, but why does it call it the mountain of God if not for the situation that we're reading about here? So again, we understand that there's holy ground here because it's where God has presented himself. It's where he has manifested himself in this burning bush and has spoken to Moses. That is what made the place holy. And notice what that demanded from Moses. He had to take his sandals off his feet. In other words, he had to remove what was common from himself, those sandals. Not that the sandals were bad, not that they were evil or unclean, but those were common objects. And for him to take them off his feet and to stand barefoot on the ground there would honor, in a sense, the holy ground on which he stood. So we're understanding the concept of holiness through this situation, through something we already probably had a little bit of awareness of. So understand, it's not about the geography. It's not about the land itself necessarily. It's about the fact this is where God appeared to one of his servants, spoke to him from that burning bush. That is what makes this place holy. And it also shows us that approaching God, who is holy, demands certain things from the people who approach him. So going back to our slideshow here, We see a couple other instances of this. Now, we're not going to read these, but just talk about them briefly. We find that the Levites, we've talked about the Levites briefly as we've gone through our conversations about the Old Testament. We're going to get into more detail as we go through this as well. But the Levites were the priests who served God in the tabernacle, and later on they served in the temple. And we see that this was mostly made up of Aaron and his sons, who were the ones actually offering sacrifices and dealing with that side of the priesthood. There were other tribes, or not other tribes, but other families within the Levites that took care of the other responsibilities. But in a place like Leviticus chapter 8 and verses 1 through 3, we find there that the Levites, the sons of Aaron here, had to be dedicated to God's service and declared holy by him through a very specific procedure. Because for them to approach God, they had to meet certain characteristics and criteria. They had to be set apart and dedicated to his service to approach him acceptably. When we talk about Exodus chapter 30 here, verses 22 through 29, we talk about the altar, talk about the tabernacle, the Ark of the Covenant, the lampstand, all of these different things that would be in the tabernacle itself and be used for God's divine service. And all of those objects had to be declared holy. Now again, we realize that fabric is not inherently holy. We realize that a golden lampstand is not inherently holy. But the point that is being made in those passages is not to fixate in on the objects themselves, but rather to fixate in on their purpose and what they're going to be doing. This is not the lampstand in your house. This is not the tabernacle in your backyard. These are objects that are dedicated to God's service. They are used for his purposes and his purposes alone. That is what makes them holy. And thus, that's why they have to be cleansed. That's why they have to be dedicated, for them to be fit to approach a holy God and serve him and please him in that service, and to not be consumed. So once again, to reiterate what we've already mentioned, whether we're talking about Exodus chapter 3 with Moses and his encounter there with the burning bush and talking with God, whether we're talking about Leviticus 8 and the sons of Aaron and their dedication, we're talking about the tabernacle and the furnishings that were in there, no matter what we're talking about, the commonality that links all of these together is they were associated with God and with his service, and that is what declared them to be holy and fit for his purpose. So with all that being said, let's move on to another idea that comes out of this, talking about holiness. And we realize that because God is holy, because he takes holiness seriously, because it's so fundamental to who he is, that whoever approaches him must strive for holiness. Now, this is something that starts getting a bit more into application, but I think we understand the basics of holiness enough to where we can really have this conversation. We must understand that some of the severest consequences for sin in the Old Testament occurred because the offenders neglected God's holiness. In other words, to make that even simpler, they didn't approach God the way that he wanted them to. They did not respect him and revere him the way that they needed to, and they paid the price. Now, we read these today and we think, wow, that was severe. I mean, that seems a bit overboard. But that's why we understand that the holiness of God is not something to be treated casually. It's not to be treated like it's something common. Like we already talked about when we talk about holy ground, or we talk about holy priests, or we talk about holy objects. They are not to be treated like they are common because they are dedicated to God's service and they are cleansed according to his word. That is what makes them significant, and they are not to be treated lightly as a result. So one specific instance that we likely know fairly well, Nadab and Abihu, illustrates the severe consequences for neglecting the holiness of God. So let's go over to Leviticus chapter 10, verses 1 through 3. And if you're like me, you've heard this passage used in a lot of different ways. I'm not going to comment too much on those different ways because the focus here is on holiness, and I think this passage really drives that point home. So just join me here in the reading of Leviticus chapter 10. We're going to read just verses 1 through 3. Then Nadab and Abihu, the sons of Aaron, each took his censer and put fire in it, put incense on it, and offered, notice this, profane fire before the Lord, which he had not commanded them. So fire went out from the Lord and devoured them, and they died before the Lord. And Moses said to Aaron, this is what the Lord spoke, saying, by those who come near me, I must be regarded as holy, and before all the people I must be glorified. What was the issue with Nadab and Abihu and what they did? There's a couple of things that come out. In verse 1, they did something that God did not command them. Specifically, it says they offered profane fire, which he had not commanded them. That was really a big problem by itself right there. But there was a deeper problem even beyond the profane fire. It was the way they thought they could approach God on their own terms. It was the way they saw God that was the issue that led them to think they could offer profane fire and have him justify that. Because notice what God says in verse 3. This is where it really all comes down to understanding why this was a problem. By those who come near me, I must be regarded as what? As holy. In other words, when you approach God in service, when you approach him in the avenue of sacrifice like Nadab and Abihu did, you must revere him in his service and be careful about what you're doing. Don't treat it casually. Don't approach it from a standpoint of, this is no big deal, because it is a big deal to enter into the presence of God, to offer these sacrifices. This is momentous. Nadab and Abihu simply did not respect God through what they did. Otherwise, would they have offered profane fire? So the profane fire is an issue, no question there. But another bigger issue is the attitude they had that led them to do that in the first place. They didn't see God as holy, they didn't revere him and respect him the way he commanded, and thus they died before him. Not a desirable outcome by any means, but that's the penalty they had to pay because they refused to honor God and his holiness. I'm going to take you to another passage here, 2 Samuel chapter 6 and verse 6 and 7. Now, this is another familiar passage and also used in a variety of ways, but again, it demonstrates a lack of respect for God's holiness. And it's not something we usually talk about to that point of neglecting God's holiness, but that's really what's going on here. So 2 Samuel chapter 6, verses 6 through 7. And when they came to Nachon's threshing floor, Uzzah put out his hand to the ark of God and took hold of it, for the oxen stumbled. Then the anger of the Lord was aroused against Uzzah, and God struck him there for his error, and he died there by the ark of God. Now think about this for a minute. So here they are, they're taking the ark of God, trying to take it to Jerusalem. They have it on a cart, which is what the Philistines had done before back in the book of 1 Samuel, and that was its own problem. So here they have it on a cart. They were not hauling it the way that God told them to do it, so that's a big issue right there, like Nadab and Abihu offering profane fire. And when the oxen stumble as they're carrying this cart and carrying the ark on that cart, Uzzah reaches his hand out to stabilize the ark, because if he didn't, he must have thought that it would fall, and of course, touching it, he was put to death by the Lord for that outbreak and for that sin. Now, what made this such an issue? Now, we can understand Uzzah's perspective here. We can understand why he did what he did. We can have a bit of mercy and compassion to that end because we realize it was a very human thing to do. But fundamentally, Uzzah and all those with him, especially King David, because he presided over this, he did not consider the holiness of God with this. And when you really get down to it, and 1 Chronicles makes this a little bit clearer, David was responsible for this because he did not revere God the way that he should have. That Uzzah's death really was on David's account because he did not do what God wanted him to do. He was not moving the ark the way that God commanded. He should have known better. He should have understood God's holiness demanded better. He was treating it like it was something common. Now again, we don't typically think of this account in that light, but that's likely what's going on here and why God did what he did and why he was angry with Uzzah, because his holiness was being disrespected. So all that is to say, once again, that you do not play with God's holiness. When you approach him in service, no matter what that service happens to be, you have to come before him in the right manner, with reverence and respect for him and who he is, and to not treat him casually, not to think that he's not worth the effort, not to think that his service is meaningless, but to be very mindful of how meaningful it really is. So that leads us to our final slide here. And understanding when we talk about God's holiness, we realize that when we boil it all down to its basic component, it's the reality that he's far greater than all else that exists. When we come before God, we are dealing with the creator of the universe. We are dealing with a deity that is far greater than our minds can really fathom to the fullest extent. It's not that we can't understand God and what he has said. I'm not alleging that at all. But I'm saying that there is so much to God and so much that we don't know about him that it naturally causes us to pause and realize how great he really is. It causes us to realize that he is nothing like we've encountered in this world. He is set apart from it. He's not subject to the same weaknesses that we find in it or the same limitations that we find in it. He is far above these things. He is set apart in that respect. He created the world, yes. He's responsible for all of these things. But at the same time, he is fundamentally different. He's not subject to the same troubles that we find in this world. And yet, the beautiful thing about the holiness of God is that despite his grandeur in this respect, and despite the fact that he is set apart and the fact that he is not common, he invites humanity into a relationship with him. He is willing, out of his sense of holiness, to invite humanity, which frankly we understand is not holy as a general rule, but he gives humanity a means to be holy before him. And he's done that, of course, through his son Jesus. Now, I know it's a class about the Old Testament as we go through this, but we understand that Jesus factors greatly into this conversation too. But God invites mankind, humanity in general, into that relationship with him through Jesus, and that is how we can be holy before him today. And the thing is also that God teaches his people how to be holy in the way they live their lives. That takes us back to Leviticus chapter 19 in the Old Testament. That takes us to the letter of 1 Peter in the New Testament. God teaches his people how to be holy as he is holy. So again, going back to what we talked about at the beginning, holiness does not mean what we typically think it does. There is a sense where, yes, there is a divide between us and God, but God has created a bridge through Jesus to help us to get over that divide, to be like he is in that sense. Not that we're going to be set apart in the exact same way. Not that we're going to be of the same moral character in the exact same way, but it's to say that we can have that association with him and be like he wants us to be. That's what it comes down to when it comes to holiness. And it means that when we are holy, we can approach him the way that he wants us to approach him. That our worship and our service to him becomes acceptable because we're not treating him casually. We're not looking at him as something that is common and unclean. We're looking at him as who he really is. A God who is worth our love, our devotion, and our reverence because we understand how holy he is. So the question comes down to this as we think about how we can personally apply it. Are we going to approach God with reverence because we understand that he's holy? Or are we going to do so with negligence? We know there's a consequence for approaching him in negligence. We saw Uzzah, we saw Nadab and Abihu, and there's many other examples we could cite of people who did not esteem God as holy, and they paid a penalty for it. But we can also cite examples of those who revered God and approached him acceptably, who really understood that God was not to be treated lightly, but to be treated with the utmost respect. And God honored them as a result of that and accepted their worship, and he was pleased by what they did. And I believe we'd rather fall into that camp than the camp of negligence. That's all for this episode, and we'll resume in our next conversation talking more about the perspectives on God we receive from the Old Testament. But as always, I hope this lesson has been beneficial to you. Hopefully it's enlightened you a little bit more about holiness and adjusted your thinking to be a bit more in line with what Scripture teaches us. And hopefully we will all continue to learn and to grow through the series. Thank you.